Welcome everybody to the 49th Strand Group event. Today marks the launch of Michael Barber's new book, Accomplishment: How to Achieve Ambitious and Challenging Things, published by Alan Lane. In the book, Michael has created a tapestry of compelling case studies, I'd call it, to explain accomplishment across many fields, from personal endeavours to collective endeavours. There's everything in there. It's a really rich book. And it is available to buy now, so do buy a copy if you haven't already. I happen to have the paperback, the Kindle edition, and the audiobook, and recommend all three. I've been looking forward to chairing this event for some time now, particularly as I was fortunate to spend a substantial part of my life on a PhD looking at how Michael and Tony work together in government on the Prime Minister's delivery unit, using Michael's diaries from the time. So I've got a unique and granular insight into some of the stories that are in the book. So we can go into that later. But as I say, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Sir Michael Barber himself and Tony Blair. Neither need any introduction, I hope. If you've made it this far, you know who they are. But I would say that during and after government, they have both continued to pursue change across the UK and around the world in quite an inexhaustible and, to me, admirable fashion. And they continue to do so today. We saw yesterday the announcement of a new delivery unit in number 10, 20 years on from the creation of the first one. But today we're discussing the book, Accomplishment, and there'll be time for a Q&A later. So do submit your questions into the Zoom Q&A box and we'll get round to them. But without much further ado, Michael, Tony, welcome back to the Strand Group. And Michael, I'll hand over to you to talk us through the book, why you wrote it, what you hope readers can take away from it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michelle. And I hope the next book launch that I speak at King's College will be the launch of your PhD as a book. I think it's a fantastic piece of work. For those of you listening in, Michelle is the only person who's read my diaries. I wrote them, but I can't remember what I wrote down. But Michelle's been through them thoroughly. And she wrote a fantastic story of the delivery unit with all its challenges. And then just to say to Tony Blair, it's a pleasure to work with you always. I shall be eternally grateful for the opportunities you gave me 20 years ago. They were the highlight of my working life, and it's great to be with you. On the book, it turns out that the book's published just as the lockdown hopefully is beginning to fade, at least in our country. And I obviously didn't plan that. I started writing it before I knew anything about lockdowns and coronaviruses. But it is a good moment for individuals and organizations and governments to think about accomplishments, to think about new things to do, to think about ambitious objectives. And the book's called Accomplishment: How Ambitious and Challenging Things Get Done, because anybody can do easy things. You don't need a book about that. This is about really difficult things. And it shows there's a pattern there. So the book is universal. It's for everybody, whether it's you as an individual, you as a part of an organization, you as your country, or even towards the end, it talks about some of the challenges facing humanity. And I think there is this new sense of purpose as we come out of lockdown for all of us at different levels. So it's a positive book. It shows there's a pattern. And if you follow the pattern, you've got a good chance of accomplishing ambitious and challenging things. That doesn't mean, by the way, that it's easy. It just means you can do it as long as you stick at it, work hard at it. And the pattern, which obviously takes a book to explain, but it has the following characteristics: ambition, be ambitious, be bold. When Tony Blair was Prime Minister, he was constantly saying to people, don't just tell me about all the constraints you face. Tell me what you would do if you took the constraints away. Be bold, be ambitious. And that's a really important lesson, not just for governments, but for organizations and individuals. Secondly, once you've got the ambition and you've defined it, have a plan. It doesn't need to be a perfect plan. Don't spend ages planning. Have a plan though, and get started. And then track progress. Is it working? Is it not working? And you've got to persist. These things are difficult. You often go through a dip where you've said you're going to do something and then it gets really hard before it gets better. I call it the implementation dip. Don't get deflected either by the problems you run into or by the critics who'll say, oh, this is not working, go off and do something else. To do ambitious and challenging things, by definition, you don't know all you need to know at the beginning. If you knew all you needed to know at the beginning, it wouldn't be ambitious and challenging. You just follow the playbook. But on these difficult things, you have to learn as you go. So you have to design a system where you get better at doing what you're doing all the way through. And I take examples from Dennis Bergkamp learning to play football and Gareth Southgate preparing the England football team for a penalty shootout, where learning as you go becomes absolutely fundamental. And then, of course, you run into problems because however well you plan, the world never turns out exactly the way you anticipated. So you have to solve problems as you go. And there's stuff on that. And then equally importantly, if it's more than just you, you've got to widen the circles of leadership. If you're doing a big thing, you can start with a handful of people, but in the end, you need lots of people. How are you consistently planning to widen the circles of leadership around what you want to do? And then eventually you might achieve your goal. And here's the last but very important lesson. When you achieve your goal, don't expect everybody to widely acclaim it and applaud you, especially if you're a government. I mean, Tony will remember we the government of that time achieved all those health waiting times targets in 2004 and 2005. The press did not write lots of articles saying, well done, the government for hitting the waiting time targets. They say, what are you doing about MRSA and hospital-acquired infections? So the agenda moves on. So don't do things because you want to be acclaimed or applauded. Do them because it's the right thing to do. And if you get a bit of adulation and acclaim, so much the better, but that's not the reason for doing it. That, I think, is all I'll say by way of introduction, Michelle. And as you said, the book's full of stories from sport, science, art, music, history, the present, whatever, and governments all over the world that illustrate these themes, hopefully in an engaging and compelling way.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Tony, do you have some initial comments on the book and what you've read of it so far?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I mean, Accomplishment is a really interesting book because it's applicable way beyond politics or delivery or the processes of government. And one of the things I learned about leadership is that the qualities and the attributes, the characteristics, both of the challenges and how you overcome them are really the same whether you're running a country, a company, a community center, or you're just an individual, running your own life, as it were.
Yeah.
And, it's very interesting. I used to say to people that when you're at the G7 and you're with the top leaders, the American president, the top leaders in the world, the dynamics of that meeting are no different from those in the Trimden Labour Club committee meetings. You've got 7 or 8 people sitting around the table. There's always someone who's yapping on before they've really thought what they want to say. There's always someone else that's trying to divert the agenda onto something completely different. And then there's usually someone who comes in with a practical suggestion that everyone adopts. I mean, but it's no different whether you're at the highest level or right down at the grassroots. And the other thing is that these things that Michael goes through in an accomplishment, things like having a very clear strategic purpose, getting the policy part of it right, going through your dip and coming back out again, understanding how you have to handle criticism. I mean, that applies to any position of leadership you're in. It really doesn't matter. I mean, you're running a football team, it's the same discipline. So I think it's really interesting from that point of view. I think the second thing is it's particularly important to study this at a time of change. My theory of the world today is that it's changing faster than ever before, that the single biggest challenge, say, for political parties, but you could say the same for companies, is that they don't keep up with the change. And you've got this technology revolution that, in my view, is changing everything. It's the single biggest challenge for people in politics. Yet if you wander into a room of politicians virtually anywhere in the world today, in a parliament, and say to them, talk to me about technology, they'll say, yeah, well, what about Facebook and privacy? But what they won't do is say, here's how you revolutionize your healthcare system or your education system through the application of technology. Yet these are really the questions that are going to determine the future. So one of the things the book does as well, I think, which is interesting, is it shows you how you've got to keep up with the pace of change. And, it can so easily happen in any walk of life that the world changes around you, and you just don't have the framework of decision making which allows you to analyze that change, keep up with it, and then make sure you can harness it to your advantage. So I think it's interesting for all of those reasons as well. And one other thing, when Michael was saying, you get a lot of applause for what you achieve. I remember when I was going to fight my second election. So we were elected in 1997, then we were fighting a second election campaign in 2001. And I remember being out on the campaign trail, and we'd been listing all our accomplishments in the first term. And I get a telephone call from Bill Clinton, and he phones me and says, "Yeah, how you doing, man? How's it all going?" And I said, "Oh, it's all going fine. We're doing well." He said, and I said, "Yeah, we've told them about, how we've done this, we've done that." And the next thing he said, "Yeah, so he said you've been telling them all your achievements." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, in that case, they may just say thank you very much and move on." So I said, he said, "No, you've got to tell them your achievements are fine, but actually what you've then got to do is you've got to lead them into the next phase. So don't just sit there on your laurels and think because you've achieved something or accomplished something, that's it. The game's over." No, if you want to carry on governing, you've got to persuade people there's a new chapter, and there's a new chapter of accomplishment if you give me the chance. So yeah, you've always got to keep moving.
I think that it's an interesting, having looked at the sort of 600,000 words or so of Michael's diaries, it sometimes is and the book, there can be a little bit of tension between delivering what you've already said you're going to do and keeping the fuel for the fire of what comes next. But as a prime minister, as a leader, you have to do both and many more things. Michael, would you like to respond to that, or should we get into the themes of the book?
No, I thought that was a great story to finish with, and I really appreciate Tony's comments on the book. And that sense of never being satisfied is what comes through. If you look at the sports people that appear in the book, or the leaders of government, there's never a moment when they think they can rest on their laurels, they can be satisfied. You've always got to be moving, because Tony's first point was all about the changing nature of the world, and the moment you rest on your laurels, you're losing ground.
Yes. All right then. I thought we would look at a few themes from the book, not all of them because there's so much in there. It really is, as I was saying to Michael before this session began, I mean, I've read the whole book, but I feel like I could dip back into it because the stories are so rich. There's so much you can get from it, but let's get going on some of the themes. So Tony, the first big theme of Michael's book is bold ambition. Can you offer some thoughts on the importance of bold ambition while reflecting on your own accomplishments or some that you've observed?
Yeah, I think you need bold ambitions to carry people with you, and because again, to make the point about the changing world, if it's changing fast, your ambitions got to be commensurate. And I think this touches on something that's really, really important that I found as a really important life lesson, and that is to have a clear strategic goal. So not just a day-to-day thing, but something which sets out like the house on the hill. That's where we're going to. So I think Michael actually recounts in the book when people were saying, I was saying we have to cut, I want to halve crime when we're a government. Look, we've got a real law and order problem. I want to actually halve crime. And people were saying, well, that's just a ridiculous ambition. Crime's gone up in every government there's been since the war. And I remember getting a presentation when I first got into Downing Street. I got a presentation on law and order. And the guys came in and gave me the presentation, and they said to me, "Sir Prime Minister, the economy's actually doing quite well. It's growing fast. And as a result of that, you're going to find that crime will go up because people are going to be purchasing more consumer goods, and therefore there's going to be more theft and burglary and so on. So crime's going to go up if the economy does really well and unemployment falls." And I sort of said, but I was always taught that if unemployment rises, that's when crime goes up. And they said, yeah, no, that's true too. So I said, so basically, crime just goes up. They said, yeah, more or less, yeah, that's it really. I said, no, guys, I think we've got to change this paradigm. So having a bold ambition doesn't mean that, say, it's got to be a realistic ambition. It's got to be strategic. And it's also you've got to carry your own team with you. So it's got to have some values underneath it that inspire it and make people think, yeah, we want to get behind that. Because the other thing that's really important when you're making change is, anyone will tell you, and it's absolutely true, it's dependent not just on the leader, but the team. And the team's got to feel enthused, they've got to feel committed. And one of the things, because my institute's now quite a large organization with over 300 people working in it. And, the thing I always say is I want people to feel committed. I don't want people to turn up and think this is just a job. I want them to be committed. But people don't get committed unless they feel there's a big, bold goal and there's something that goal is accomplishing that is going to be good.
Yes. And Michael, in the book, you linking to that, you write, the biggest, boldest goals are not always evidence-based or set by experts. It's not just about the evidence. Profound integrity and deeply held belief go a long way. Could you reflect a little bit on that theme?
Well, I'm just picking up the point Tony made. You do have to, underpinning all of this, there has to be a set of values. And one of the strong messages in accomplishment is you've always got to remember, whatever you're doing and wherever you are in attempting to achieve your accomplishment, remember your ethical underpinning, why you're doing it and how you want to go about it. And that is a fundamental insight. And I agree with Tony completely that you've got to motivate people. And there are some people who think that people are put off by bold ambition and motivated by incrementalism. I don't generally think that's true. I think you want to be aspirational. I think people, as they say, will get out of bed for something really exciting and bold with the right values and the right sense of direction. You meet a lot of people in government circles around the world who say we should under-promise and over-deliver. I'm always a bit skeptical about that because of the points that we've been making about the degree to which the world is changing. I think if you're under-promising and over-delivering, it's probably you're either doing incredibly well for the moment and then you may be plateauing. The story I like in my book about this best is Simon Timpson and Chelsea Waugh, who were the people at UK Sport in charge of performance immediately after the London Olympics of 2012. And no country in the world has ever got more medals at the Olympics after the one they hosted. And they sat down immediately after London 2012 and said, why don't we set a target for Rio to get even more medals than we got in London? And lots of people are saying, you're crazy, look at the evidence. Nobody's ever done it before. That's my point about the expert. You've got to take the experts into account. They're important, they know a lot, but you shouldn't let them decide your target necessarily. They should inform it. And that's what they did. And then they went through London. Well, could we have won a medal there? Or couldn't we have done a bit better in that sport? And they decided, yes, they could. So even though they had less money, because obviously the government had invested more in the host Olympics, they set a target to exceed both on the Paralympics and the Olympics, the number of medals they got in 2012. And they did that in Rio. And the story of how they did that is a phenomenal piece of delivery, just really consistent, reorganizing the way swimming as a sport was organized in Britain, looking for who the multi-medal winning Olympians might be. You're going to get lots of people who just win one gold medal, which most of us would think was a lifetime achievement, but they were looking for people that might win several medals. So it was a fantastic piece of work, consistently driven, sometimes controversial because they took money out of things like synchronized swimming and basketball and put it into the areas where they thought they were going to win more medals. And then we got more medals in Rio than we got in London. Phenomenal.
Absolutely. Let's move on to the theme of solving problems. Tony, could you talk to us about problem solving as a key part of accomplishment? I understand your institute has just launched a new report on the global vaccination challenge that relates to this in terms of the pandemic.
Solving problems. So, for example, if you take the problem with vaccination today, so essentially, this time last year, what people thought was that we would go into, we're still in lockdown this time last year. We come out of lockdown, we would contain COVID-19, and then we'd vaccinate kind of at leisure during 2021. And many developing countries didn't suffer so badly this time last year. And we're thinking we vaccinate 2021, 2022, 2023. And then what's happened is these mutations of the virus have come along, and they've upended all the calculations. And so we then had to go back into lockdown, and we're now having to vaccinate as fast as we possibly can here in the UK. And we're doing a pretty good job of that. But the problem is we need the rest of the world also to be vaccinated, because otherwise these mutations will continue. And at some point you'll get a mutation against which the vaccines are either much less effective or potentially not effective at all. Okay. So you've got to look at how you then take that global vaccination program that people thought would stretch over 2 or 3 years. And we're looking at the moment as an institute, we're going to publish a paper showing how you should concertina that into the next 6 to 9 months. Now, to do that, you've got to analyze, for example, the bioreactor capacity in the world right now. So you've only got 1/4 of the bioreactor capacity. That's the capacity that actually creates the kind of fluid for the vaccine, if you like. That bioreactor capacity, only 1/4 of it's being used for COVID-19 vaccines. Now, when you think about, the world's priorities right now, it's bizarre. But if you want to change that, you've got to do what has just happened with the United States government has just said to Merck in the United States, we want you repurposed for COVID-19 vaccine. And, it'll take a few months to do that, but then you're going to be producing the vaccine that we need in order to get vaccinated really fast. And then basically you're going to have to ensure that the capacity of the world to produce vaccine is radically and dramatically increased. Now, all of that is about solving a problem, but it requires you to analyze exactly what the problem is. It requires you to come up with a clear strategic framework and goal, the bold ambition we've just been talking about. And then you've got to dive into the detail, and then you've got to focus on implementation. And one of the great things that Michael did, creating the delivery unit for us in government, was it solved problems by breaking them down into their component elements, having a clear goal, breaking them down into the component elements, and then tracking delivery, the implementation. And this is where governments always fall down. I used to say to people, in my first, couple of years in Downing Street, I made the mistake of thinking that because I was Prime Minister, if I sat round the cabinet table and I took a decision and everyone said, okay, that's a decision, I was under the illusion that something then happened. And what I realized over time was, it didn't mean necessarily that anything happened. It just kind of disappeared into the system to, whichever part of it took it over. And often what they did was one of the things, I'm a great admirer of our civil service in many ways, but they were brilliant at absorbing the pressure from politicians and just kind of diffusing it. So, in the end, that implementation, that tracking is really important. So it's not just about having the right solution, it's about what the French call le suivi or la mise en œuvre, making sure that you put it in place. So this is absolutely vital. And again, that solving problems technique you could apply to any walk of life.
Yeah.
Thank you. Michael?
It's hard to beat that as an answer. I would just say 2 or 3 things. One is, it's a big tendency in government, but also I've seen this in big businesses as well, and perhaps also in my own life. The first time you discover there's a problem, there's a big tendency to underestimate it and not to do the diagnosis thoroughly. And you think, oh, it'll probably get better, or it'll probably go away. I had a friend years ago when I was at university. I quote him in the book, called Dave Keaton, who his bike stopped working. It's just something wrong with the transmission system. And I said, how are you going to fix it? He said, I'm going to put it in the garden and see if it gets better. And actually governments across the world are doing that all the time. They're putting it in the garden to see if it gets better. So the first thing is not to underestimate the problem. The second is to do really good diagnosis, as Tony's just been saying. What is exactly the problem? What's its scale and size, but also what's its complexity? And then something that's large and very complex. obviously the coronavirus is exactly that. You really have to get stuck into it in the way that Tony's been saying. Other problems will be, once you've analysed them, they're actually more straightforward. People have faced them before. We know how to solve it. So you have to assemble the knowledge and then just get on with it. That's a technical problem. But ones like the coronavirus, where it's constantly evolving and it's new to humanity, you have to learn as you go and be very systematic. But I'd say get the diagnosis right. Don't underestimate the problem, either its size or its complexity, until you've really understood it. And then it's just about driving through the solutions.
And one final thing from the book, managing relationships. I mean, as much as the framework is fundamentally important, the people are the ones who are delivering it. And I mean, much of my research on the art of delivery is on this theme. Michael, how you navigated the intractable issues and the powerful people to get delivery happening in Tony's government. And in your book, you quote David Brailsford of Team Sky as saying, "I'm convinced that successful teams emerge from emotionally robust cultures. The human side is vital and often underestimated by performance scientists." Could you both offer some comments on that? The importance of managing people, relationships in delivery.
Tony, do you want to go first on that, or do you want me to? I'm happy either way.
You're always better at that than me, so you go first.
I actually thought you were very good at it, but look, to me, inside the delivery unit, Michelle will know this from the diary, we literally did explicit conscious training almost day to day for everybody. So you can take a very difficult issue to a minister or a senior official somewhere in one of the government departments. You can take that issue on, not run away from it, address it plainly and directly, and spell out what the challenge is, make some progress towards solving it, and leave the meeting with the relationship stronger than you arrived. And if you go into a room, you watch The West Wing or you read lots of political history, you find that people go around saying the Prime Minister's sort of furious about this. What are you doing? You're letting us all down. And what you're doing is driving civil servants or ministers into a kind of defensive position where you can never solve the problem. They just, and when I used to go to Russia quite often, I only learned a few words of Russian, but they said, really, there's only two phrases you need, Michael. One is who's to blame, which is kto vinovat, and the other is what's to be done. And in government, particularly driven by the media, who's to blame is the first question. Heads must roll, whatever you're in. But as soon as you ask that first, it's very, very hard then to solve the problem. So what's to be done needs to come before who's to blame. And in the delivery unit, we made a conscious point of not thinking exactly like that. Let's solve the problem. We know, first of all, getting people to acknowledge the problem is real, and so getting away from underestimating or massaging it away, and then say, okay, well, how can we work with you to solve it? And then crucially, if the problem got solved, which many times it did, we gave them the credit for solving it. So now you're not blaming them, you're helping them solve the problem, you're identifying it and solving it, and then when it's solved, you give them the credit and you say to the Prime Minister, the Home Office has solved this problem, or the Health Department's done that, or Alan Milburn's done this and David Blunkett's done that, whatever it is. So we never wanted the credit. And I think a key thing is pushing the credit out. I asked, I don't know if you know her, Tony, she was Prime Minister of Mozambique during your time, called Luisa Diogo. I asked her when I was doing the book, how she managed to get 15% increase in GDP in a single year. And she said, well, first of all, I didn't believe the figures. And then the World Bank told me they were true. And I said, how did you do it? And she said, we didn't do it. We created the circumstances in which the people of Mozambique did it. We unlocked the music in people. And I think that's a really nice metaphor. You've got to give the credit out all the time. Justin Trudeau went into the last campaign, also talked about in the book, saying, we didn't create 500,000 jobs. Canadian business people created them. We created the circumstances. And I think that's a key lesson. If you go around over-claiming as a government, people get cynical about you. If you give the credit to others, you've got a chance.
Yeah, and I think that's very good advice, actually. And again, very broadly applicable. I mean, I think the other, so you definitely, if you want your team to work well, you've got to stand up for each other. I mean, I used to hate kind of office politics around my close team, and by and large we didn't have a lot of it, and people, Michael was one of the core people, but there were probably, I don't know, 10, 15 really core people, and people got on. And the other thing is to try and, show members of the team why they should value the skills of other people, even though they're not the same skills as they have. Because I used to find, for example, I would always have a broad spectrum of political advice. I'd have some people who were very, very Labour, and there were some people who were kind of just, they might vote Labour, but they were what I would call not particularly politically tribal at all in their thinking. And it used to be very helpful. And I was always having to say to each one of the group, you got to understand that they've got an important point of view, and this thing works better when we've got people together. And so I think keeping that sense of a sort of esprit de corps is really, really important. It was frankly much more difficult managing the cabinet. That's management of a different order. I remember when I first came into government, and there were a whole lot of fights, or the cabinet was fighting amongst themselves, and I happened to Margaret Thatcher came to see me in Downing Street, and because I used to talk to the former prime ministers from time to time, and she came in to see me in Downing Street, and we were sitting there talking, and I said to her, what did you do, Margaret, when the cabinet were all fighting each other? And she said, them fighting each other is not a problem, she said. It's when they're fighting you, it's a problem. Trying to keep your team not just focused, but with a sense that they value and respect each other, I think it's a really, really important quality.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we'll move on to the Q&A. And if I may take advantage of my position, I will start off. Tony, in a recent interview, you spoke of how crazy it is that you can become Prime Minister with such little experience. But if you had prior experience of government, would you have been as radical as you were on, say, public service reform? And would you have created this market for ideas around you, as you're referring to, all different people? If you really knew what you wanted to do before you started, if you had that much experience?
Yes, it's a good question, Michelle. I think it would have been better to have had a clearer understanding of the system. And I always say that, after about 1 year as Prime Minister, I had a meeting with my close people, including my press person, Alistair Campbell, and said, look, guys, I think, I want to be really open with people. I'm going to go out there and make a speech and say to people, look, I've been a year, I'm just still kind of learning on the job, really. And he said to me, you must on no account say this. People expect the British Prime Minister to know exactly what they're doing. You're going to see you're learning on the job, they'll panic. So I didn't do that. But the truth is, that is what you do. And I think it is an odd thing that you have, it's democracy. But it's one of the reasons Michael and I both do what we do today is to say to politicians coming into power, and I have this conversation constantly with them, there is a science to governing, right? It's not, okay, you may think that you're a genius because you won an election. Doesn't mean much. Also, the skill set that brings you to power, which is often a skill of persuasion, is not the skill set that sustains you in power, which is often a skill of executive capability. So it's really important, I think, to realize that there is an oddity about putting someone in such an important position without real experience, but you can quickly make up for that if there are people who can help you ascend the learning curve with speed.
Can I just comment on that, Michelle? I think this sense that wherever you are, whether you're in a business or making your own way in your own life, or if you're a prime minister or a minister, learning as you go and making that explicit is so fundamentally important. And Tony's right that the media and actually most people assume that once somebody's elected prime minister, they know exactly what to do, but they've got to learn how to do the job. And if you, as I have, and Tony wrote, if you read Tony's memoirs, A Journey, I think you say pretty explicitly, Tony, that by the winter of 2000, you suddenly knew what it involved. It was the health crisis. That winter was a real learning experience, that you realised that this focus on delivery was needed, that you'd mastered. And if you compare that to the research on expertise and how you get really good at something, they talk about 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, and a prime minister 3 years into office has probably had about 10,000 hours of deliberate practice dealing with these things day after day after day. I think it's unfair but inevitable that people will assume that whoever's prime minister or president, wherever they are in the world, they'll know exactly what to do from day one. And some of them may have experience in the past and may have done it. But as Tony was saying earlier, the world has changed. So this ability to learn is important. And I think I often say, when asked what's the single most important characteristic in a political leader, I think it's self-knowledge, knowing what you're really good at, but also knowing there are some things you're not really good at, but you need people who are around you and can get that done for you, and then you can build a team.
Thank you. First audience question from one of our PhD students at King's, who's doing an institutional history of the Ministry of Defence, Jan Gokshan. To what extent was the creation and implementation of the delivery unit made necessary by the relative absence of formal policy-making powers in the office of the Prime Minister and the relatively small group of officials and the political appointees at number 10? So why was it necessary?
Why was it necessary to create the delivery unit? Because I think, it's a good question, actually. There's a very obvious answer, which is in order to get things, to do the implementation side. But I think it was really because, the position of the leader is very, very important in a government. And yes, of course, individual departments are doing whatever they're doing. But if you don't have a real force at the center, driving things and pushing things, because so much of what is necessary is working across government, you find that it's not easy to get things done properly unless the center's got some insight and grip on it. So I would say that was the real reason. And actually, we don't have that many. Comparatively, for example, compared to the American system, we have very few political appointees. And so, I think it was necessary for that reason, but I also think there was another reason for us, which is, I will say, the difference between the reforms Margaret Thatcher made and the reforms I made is that Margaret Thatcher's reforms were often really accomplished by legislation, right? So you privatized something, or you introduced a new trade union law, or you had a budget where you cut the top rate of tax. Whereas, because our task, this is how I conceived our task in 1997, was really to repair the public realm, right? That means working in a system and making systemic change. And what you realize is it's much more complicated to reform healthcare or education or law and order, because you're going to put your hands right in the entrails of a system that is complicated, has many interests, and where legislation alone is not going to achieve change. So that was also, I think, a major part of the reason why we needed the delivery unit concept.
Thank you.
Just to comment on that, Michelle, I think I agree with everything Tony said, but the other thing is what you're creating for a prime minister specifically, as indeed hopefully the number 10 delivery unit announced yesterday for the current prime minister, is concentrating in a focused, driven, consistent way prime ministerial energy, power, and ambition, so that it actually changes the system. And a absolutely critical learning day for me in number 10, back then, was September the 11th, 2001. Tony's come back from a speech he would have made in Brighton. There's a lot of people milling around him, and I'm walking past the PM's office and I can see this melee of people giving Tony the advice in this massive crisis. And my first instinct was, well, I'm here to help the Prime Minister, I'll go and offer to help. But actually he had a dozen people milling around him already. So I actually paused and thought, no, actually, he doesn't need my help. He's got as much help as he needs. He needs me to keep the show on the road. I was focusing prime ministerial energy. So, and a few weeks later, I saw Tony briefly, because I had a lot going on internationally. And I said, my slogan from now on is delivery never sleeps. We're just doing this, and you can't distract me. So we'll just, and I think that was a very important insight. And otherwise, the Prime Minister's office just goes with whatever the next crisis is, and there's always something going wrong. So I think that was really important, and it's true in any accomplishment in a business or anything else. You need part of your organization, that the leader's got to do all these things. You know, if it's a business leader, you've got to go and convince the city that the shares are good value and all of those things. You need part of the organization that's focused on the change you want to make, and it's focused on it 24 hours a day. And as soon as you lose that, you risk that dissipation that Tony was talking about earlier. So I think that's a really important theme in the book, on every level, whether it's a scientist trying to solve a massive problem. I've got a couple of brilliant women scientists talking to me about how they accomplish things in the book. And it's the same thing, constant focus on the thing you care about most. And you can't avoid all those distractions if you're Prime Minister, but you can set up a bit of your government that won't be distracted. And
this is such an important point. I just want to add one thing, because I come across a lot of governments around the world, and here's the problem. They focus on delivery, the things that they care about, and then what happens is they get events, they get regional crises, they get international meetings, and very often you end up with what I call a dual track leadership. And this is where I was post 9/11. One part of it was going to be dealing with all of the aftermath of post 9/11. But I had to make sure that we kept on track with all the delivery of that domestic agenda, because in the end, by the way, that was going to be what decided whether we got re-elected or not. And I used to call the delivery unit the eye that never sleeps. So and I say this to the leaders I work with around the world today, you've got to create a system that even as your attention is diverted, which it will be by crises, events and scandals and internal politics, that focus never stops. It's always there, and you've got a system in place where you know that even if you're distracted, they're not distracted.
Mm-hmm. We're almost out of time. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'll ask one final quick question to you, Michael, from our visiting professor, John Rentoul. Does it matter that Boris Johnson's new unit is called the number 10 delivery unit rather than the Prime Minister's delivery unit? How important is it that the unit carries the PM's personal authority?
It's a great question. I just want to add one thing to what, and then I'll come to it. I just want to add one thing to what Tony just said. The other thing, going back to the conversation we had earlier about relationships, that's the other, you've got to have that focus that we've just been talking about. You've also got to be thoughtful about the relationships. Otherwise, if you go around upsetting people, you just add to the burdens on the Prime Minister. So if you go marching into the Department of Health or whatever and say the Prime Minister's incandescent about X, Y, and Z, sooner or later, the Secretary of State for Health is going to be going to Tony saying, can you call off your unit? They're driving my people crazy. And you just add to all the burden on the Prime Minister. And you've got to, if you get the relationships right, you're investing prime ministerial power and influence rather than spending it. And I think this is a fundamental point of in any big change program. And I just want to mention, because she is emblematic of the relationship we're talking about. Tessa Jowell, who is a great minister in the Blair years and a friend of Tony's and mine, and who died far too young. She modelled relationship building as a minister in a way that I've ever met before, and so people, you can read things that she's written as examples of that. But it's very important that the new number 10 delivery unit has the Prime Minister's attention, and certainly in the interactions I've had, he is absolutely focused on it, and he's explicitly wanting to learn from the delivery unit that Tony and I have been talking about, and then obviously adapt it to 20 years later. And it will need his attention all the way through to do the big ambitious agenda that he's setting for the country as we come out of the pandemic. So I don't think the change of name is to do with whether the Prime Minister will pay attention or not. I think it's, to be honest, I think you wouldn't really want to call it exactly the same thing as something 20 years ago. So it's a new name is good, but it's in number 10. It's got the support of the Cabinet Secretary as well as the Prime Minister. It's got the leader who will take charge eventually is the woman who's been running the vaccination rollout. So she won't do it now because that's got to be seen through. So it's an interim leader. But you've got a really great leader with a track record of delivery that everybody's seen and recognised, who has a good relationship, very good relationship with the Prime Minister. And I think the Prime Minister will give it attention all the way through, but that is essential. Okay,
thank you. Any final word from you, Tony?
No, just to say it's a pleasure to be with you and to converse with Michael, and just to say it's some of the things we've been talking about today. I mean, I think we talked a lot about government. These are also important things for the opposition to reflect upon as it prepares, hopefully, to be a government.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael and Tony, for such an illuminating conversation. Thank you to the audience for joining us, about 180 or so people. Do buy yourself a copy of the book, and everyone you know. It's a compelling read. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Michael. All the best.